So before we finish, we'll wind up with a little bit on some of the policy that sits behind some of these measures and the general direction of our building. And this has all been dictated by Kyoto. Now, all the EU countries got together to come up with the Kyoto Protocol in 2005, and the UK signed up to this. And so the target was that 20% of the energy should be we use in the UK should be from renewables by the date 2020. So we set up the Department for Energy and Climate Change in 2008, and off the back of that, the Renewable Energy Directive was brought in 2009 for 15% of electricity from renewables by 2020 and 5% of energy from renewables in other sources. So we've been quite lucky in the UK because our general greenhouse emissions have reduced due to the amount of industry we've lost from the UK. And so the emitters, the high emission stuff is going elsewhere, but we still produce an awful lot of our carbon dioxide emissions from either electricity generation, vehicles, or domestic premises. And so we've got this renewable energy roadmap where the government has hung its hopes on 8 key technologies to achieve this. And you'll notice these are all familiar from this lecture. So we've got wind, we've got marine energy, which is either big turbines that operate based on tidal currents, or you've got things that look like sort of long snakes or caterpillars which move around with the waves, and they've got little generators inside them which operate each time they bend. These aren't really catching on very much at the moment. I think it's because of the large upfront costs of manufacturing the things, because anything that lives in the sea has to be extremely robust. There's biomass electricity and biomass heat. So we're now at the Drax coal power station has actually been supplementing its coal intake with bamboo and other fast-growing woody plants which are produced by farmers in the locality. Ground source heat pumps and air heat pumps and renewable transport. So if we don't hit these targets under the Kyoto Agreement, we can actually be fined millions and millions and millions of pounds. And so this is something which we do need to meet. On an individual housing basis, you can start to see some of the impacts of our commitments to improve the eco-credentials of the UK in the these are following approved documents. So ventilation, to try to control levels of ventilation in properties, sanitation such as water efficiency, drainage and waste disposal systems, heat producing appliances, and conservation of fuel and power have all got measures in which consider the environment. In the approved documents, these are the guidance documents to tell builders how to comply with the building regulations. So if you change a large part of a building, they've brought this requirement in where you really should upgrade the building to the current building regulations requirements. So they are trying to address some of this work retrospectively, but most of the work that's been done retrospectively to our existing housing stock is done through incentives such as either subsidising the installation of insulation in lofts, subsidising more efficient boilers for gas, and either at all with more poorer people or vulnerable groups paying for them completely. They've got the Code for Sustainable Homes. So this is something which looks at the overall environmental impact for properties, and it's got a 1 to 6 star rating system. And so you get a code assessor in to check your finished new built property. And the idea was that once you had finished your property and you look at the energy and carbon dioxide production or usage of the property, water usage, materials and the embodied carbon from those, such as trying to avoid using that concrete, Surface water runoff issues, waste storage, construction waste, so it looks at the whole life cycle of the building. Health and well-being, so consideration of whether it's going to be a pleasant place to live and how adaptable it is for those with special needs for mobility impairment, and what it offers in the way of wildlife in the area when the construction crews have finished. So the idea with these systems was that we were sitting at 3 and we gradually eased that up to 4, where you're putting a lot more insulation in the structure and possibly some energy generation such as photovoltaics on the roof. And we're kind of floating around that point at the moment with the more environmentally friendly properties. But we did originally have an aim by 2016 to up it to 5, which is a 0 carbon building, and then eventually to get up to 6 by 2020, which would be a net carbon negative building. So this is a building which will actually remove carbon from the atmosphere in its lifespan. That's usually through energy generation, so it would be a net energy generator. So we've had variable success for that.